Previously on Mostly Useless Garage, very quietly we replaced the rear brake pads and rotors, and brake fluid leaked through the emergency brake adjustment screw, and on inspection the pad wear was horrifically uneven, which means the calipers are cooked and need to be replaced.
Or we can rebuild it ourselves, so let's do that. And the first thing we need to do is remove the caliper from the car so we can work on it on the bench. As a reminder, I'm running Flying Miata 1.6 rear brake caliper relocation brackets, these purple things back here, which allow the use of these larger 10.9-inch sport package rotors. If you're new to Miatas, only some NBs came stock with larger rear rotors, but they can be used on all NA and NB Miatas if you relocate the rear brake caliper using an aftermarket adapter bracket. I have an install video where I did just that. Check that out up here after you finish watching this video. But for stock brakes, the removal process is pretty much the same. First, let's remove the emergency brake line from the caliper, which is this thing here, which goes up here, and we need to remove this 14mm bolt.
Now we can remove the e-brake line from the lever arm. This is an aftermarket steel braided brake line, and we need to loosen but not remove the 14mm banjo bolt. But we do want to remove this 14mm cover bolt that hides a 4mm hex adjustment screw underneath that winds back the piston. Next we remove this plastic cap, and then remove the lower guide pin using a 10mm ratcheting box wrench, which gets stuck right here.
I did it to myself. Alright, so loosening off the bracket here, I've been able to rotate this out of the way so I can get this off.
And we can lift the caliper up and out of the way to pull the brake pads and shims. Now we remove the brake line banjo bolt, being careful to catch the fluid, and take note of the copper washers on either side of the banjo fitting. I also taped up the brake line hoping it wouldn't spill too much fluid, but if I'm honest, it didn't really make much of a difference. But anyway, let's slide the caliper off the upper guide pin, and on the bench we can take a look at this original low mileage, rust-free 1990 Mazda rear caliper. Now onto the rebuild, let's remove the brake bleeder screw, the emergency brake lever arm spring, being careful not to shoot this into our face, and using that 4mm hex we extend the piston, or at least try to, as I realize there's a bit of a problem.
Well, it looks like I'm cooked. This thing is totally stripped. You can see the splines have sheared off.
While I think about what to do, let's continue with the disassembly by removing the guide pin boots, the piston dust boot, and because the adjustment screw isn't working, we need to rotate the piston to remove it from the bore, trying to be careful not to damage the piston itself. And with that extracted, here's what it looks like in the piston bore. Notice there's a threaded rod that's held in by a circlip.
These are circlip pliers.
Inserting them into the bore, these are perfect to free that circlip from its grooved seat. And behold, the threaded rod and circlip. But let's not forget about this tiny but very important dowel rod. Now we can slide the e-brake lever arm out of its bore, and take a closer look at how this all works, starting with that circlip. Here's that threaded rod that's got an O-ring seal and those curious splines on the end that line up with the splines on our adjustment screw if they weren't stripped, and a tiny dowel rod sits on the end here and in the cup of the lever arm like this. Of course, it also threads into the back of the piston like so. Alright, let's get this square seal out of its home, remove the grease seal for the lever arm, and give it a good clean inside and out. For the spots where I don't want debris to get into, I like to use old earplugs to block the holes. We can even double or triple them up for bigger holes. And for the piston bore, we stuff some shop towels in there and cover it up with painter's tape. With the caliper in my bench vise, it's time to strip it down with a wire wheel. As I said before, these are original equipment from 1990 in really good condition, and in my opinion, worth restoring.
So about that splined adjustment screw that lives at the back of the caliper that pushes the piston in and out, it's stripped. That's my fault. But I have a few options to fix it. I could try to buy one of those screws directly from Mazda and wait for however long it takes to deliver it. I could try to find a Miata part out somewhere in the city and maybe if they have a caliper, salvage it from one of those. I could try to buy a whole caliper, a brand new one from one of those online retailers like the one that starts with an A, but that would kind of negate the whole purpose of doing this caliper rebuild thing. And the last option I found from Miata.net, and it was suggested by one of their senior contributors. He suggests trying to grind the thing down past the strip part of the splines to where there's still some splines intact. And I figured that since that's the fastest way for me to rebuild this caliper so I can put it back on the car today, we may as well try that. And that's why we have this thing set up over here like this.
So that's looking pretty good. It engages nicely with the threaded rod, and after filing off any burrs, it should work nicely. Phew, disaster averted.
Now that we got this caliper painted in the fastest color there is, let's go ahead and rebuild it.
And the first seal to replace is the O-ring on the threaded rod that simply slides off like this. Incidentally, this is the one that I think was leaking, but it still looks pretty fresh for its age. And now we can install the new O-ring, rolling it into its groove. Next, we can start reassembling things, starting by greasing up the ebrake lever arm bore with Permatex Ultra Disc Brake Caliper Lube. And I always keep a supply of toothpicks on hand. They're surprisingly versatile tools. This is our new grease seal that goes here, and we can use an appropriately sized socket to press it into place. Looking at the lever arm shaft, there's a cup for the dowel rod that needs to be lubed up. But for the shaft, if we lube that up and slid it into the bore, the lube would be wiped off by the seal and make a mess. So we just apply a bit more lube on the seal, gently slide it into place, and rotate it a few times to distribute the grease inside. For the threaded rod, we grease up the cup, get some grease on the O-ring, and pop our dowel rod into the grease so it hangs in there. Now we insert that back into the piston bore, rotate the parking brake lever so the dowel pin sits into the cup, and we can actually feel the threaded rod push in and out. And to hold it in place, we need to reinstall this circlip with our handy dandy 90-degree circlip pliers. Notice we need to position it almost flush with the end of the fingers. Now we summon our childhood operation skills, placing it down at the bottom of the bore in its small retaining groove, and push down on it with a small screwdriver to make sure it's seated. Here's our modified adjustment screw again. We lube this guy up, slide it into its home, and give it a few twists to see if it works. Huzzah! Now for the e-brake lever spring. This requires a bit of technique to tension it, slide it over the arm, and not fire it into our eyeball. Onto the piston seals, we need to install the new square seal into the bore down here. No need to lube this up now, we install it dry, being careful that it doesn't get twisted and it's sitting nice and flat. Using some brake fluid like this Motul RBF 600, we give the square seal and bore a good coating. This will help as we ease the piston in and engage it with the threaded rod. Now this outer seal is a pain in the butt, but it's the thing that prevents moisture and debris from fouling up the piston. So let's extend the piston a bit, add a few drops of silicone lube, squeeze the seal over, and ensure it's in the groove on the piston. Next is the annoying bit. We use a small flathead screwdriver to tuck the seal lip into its home in between the piston and bore, being very careful not to damage the rubber seal. Working our way around, tucking a few drops of lube and tucking some more until it's finally seated. Then we check our work by screwing the piston in and out, inspecting the seal as we go. With that out of the way, we can install the guide pin boots. This longer one for the lower guide pin squeezes into here, and the smaller one slides onto here. Almost done. Here's our new bleeder screw that threads in over here, snugged up with an 8mm. And after a quick wipe down with some simple green, this is our freshly rebuilt caliper. Over here on the car, we use a 6mm hex to unbolt the old upper guide pin. It's held in pretty good with some Loctite, so we need to be careful not to round it off. And we replace it with this new one. Of course, you could reuse your existing guide pins if they're in good condition. Now we grease up the inside of the upper guide bore and the seal, slide it onto the upper guide pin, and move it around to distribute the grease. We're in the home stretch. It's time to reinstall the retaining clips and the brake pads, get our e-brake line reattached to the lever arm, reinstall the 14mm e-brake bolt, reinstall the brake line, ensuring there's a copper washer on either side of the banjo fitting, grease the inside of the lower guide pin seal, reinstall the lower guide pin, And for me, I reinstalled the 14mm bracket bolt that I removed earlier.
There we have it, everything's reinstalled, torqued to spec, looking pretty, and off camera I did a pedal bleed on all 4 corners to ensure there's no air bubbles in the system. But that's how you rebuild your Miata's rear calipers at home using low-cost parts and hand tools, all within the comfort of your own garage. Now, the obvious and frankly unimaginative question is, why didn't you just buy new ones? They're like $100 each. To which one might reply, buy new ones, why not just bring it to the dealership and have them fix it? And while we're there, why don't we buy a new car while we're at it? One of the appeals of owning an old Miata is that all the mechanicals are dead simple, parts are readily available for pennies, and if you can turn a wrench, you can do this with a bit of care and elbow grease. Besides, have you ever noticed that there's kind of 2 minds about stuff like this? On the one hand, you have those that value the end result. There's a problem, somebody's got to fix it, and there's only suffering until it's fixed. On the other, you have those that value the process, diagnosing a problem, determining a fix, and doing it yourself. And in the doing of yourself, you end up leveling up your skills, knowledge, and confidence. Since you're still here, I think I know which one of those you are. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share the channel with your Miata friends. That'd be super cool. And for those of you watching from New Zealand, kia ora rawa atu, ka kite ano, and until next time, you're awesome. I'm mostly useless. Thanks very much for watching.